This part of Bob's career as a fireman at Eastleigh relates to a duty where, on their return working, they would work the 1906 vans from Waterloo to Eastleigh. As a fireman at Guildford in earlier times, I remember working this train from Waterloo to Woking with an S15 class locomotive, which was then timed slightly earlier at 7:02 p.m. So when Bob relayed his story to me, I fully understood the anxiety he felt. On leaving Waterloo, my driver, the late Bill Soule, really larruped the locomotive to Hampton Court Junction, where you were expected to pass this point in 18 minutes. I can remember that once we cleared Hampton Court Junction within the time specified, I remember seeing the relief on Bill's face, as I suspect he was worried that he would receive a lost time ticket. In Bob's case, the locomotive they had was a Guildford-based locomotive, U-Class number 31803, and although I have quite a few photographs of this engine in my collection, I only have one of her working a van train, depicted leaving Guildford with the Blissworth vans to Red Hill. The other unfortunate thing is, there weren't many photographs taken of van trains, and hope this doesn't distract viewers from Bob's stories.
During my time as a fireman at Eastleigh, I worked on about 20 different UNN class locos. We used to get them fairly regularly on our Southampton terminus to Bournemouth stopping services, and occasionally on Portsmouth to Salisbury workings. A U-boat over the Netty Row was an interesting experience. 1803 shows up fairly regularly in my diaries, and it was on her that I had two really memorable trips that clearly illustrated the capability of these versatile engines. On Monday, the 27th of September 1965, Des Ollie and I booked on for the week on 221 and 252 duty. We signed on at 2:28 in the afternoon, walked to Eastleigh Station, and relieved on a Southampton docks to Feltham diesel-hauled freight train. At Woking, we got relief by, I think, a Feltham crew, and then travelled passenger to Waterloo for our back working. After a visit to the White Hart for a couple of pints with our sandwiches, we walked back to Waterloo to relieve 9 Elms men and work the 1906 vans, which was a parcels and mail train, back to Eastleigh. This train was regularly loaded in excess of 15 vehicles, and on a Monday we struggled to time the train with 7611 on the Waterloo-Woking section. On Tuesday, 75074, and Wednesday, 73113, things went rather better. On the Thursday evening, Des and I walked through the barrier gates to find a string of vans stretching away up round the curve of platform 16. As we approached the country end of the platform, I could see that the engine was well outside the platform starting signal, and the guard was waiting at the platform end to give us a load, accompanied by a platform supervisor who would tell us that the signal was cleared and which route it was indicating for us on departure. Much to my horror, standing at the front was a U-class engine, and only having worked light trains with them, I was a little bit alarmed as to how this was going to go. But Des said, "Yeah, you'll be all right, boy," he said. We'll be all right. So the guard gave us the load, and he told us that we had 18 vehicles on for 396 tonnes, just short of 400 tonnes. Now, between 3 and 5 coaches, say 200 tonnes maximum with a Class 4 engine on a stop at Bournemouth is one thing, but fast from Waterloo to Woking with 400 tonnes on the drawbar is, as they say, a completely different kettle of fish. And I could now see that the engine was 31803, which was a Guildford engine at the time, and we climbed on board to relieve the 9 Elms crew. The cab was clean and tidy, with a good fire made up under the door and a tender full of reasonable looking coal. I think Des could tell I was a little apprehensive, and he said, "Fill her right up under the door, bruv." He always called me bruv, and he said, "She'll be all right." Departure time was fast approaching, and the back damper was opened, and 1803 was making steam with the fire door open to avoid making smoke. The guard made a brake test, and I looked back for the tip, This engine was a right-hand drive engine, so I had to look back along the platform from my side for the guard's tip. His green light was repeated by the platform supervisor with the information, "Right away, mate, green down main through." Des worked the regulator, and 1803 struggled to move the heavy load. There was no assisting engine on the rear. He was conscientious and very able engineman and got the train away with a minimum of fuss. It's perhaps worth noting at this juncture that every vehicle on the train would have been fitted with plain white metal axle bearings. Much is made of the performance of preserved locos and their crews on the main line today, and I sometimes wonder if people realise how much additional rolling resistance these bearings and jointed track created when compared to modern roller bearings and continuous welded rail. Add to this the fact that preserved mainline locos are looked after in a manner that was unheard of in the final years of BR steam, and you can begin to see why most locos and crews appear to do so well today. And you can also see why I was a little bit apprehensive about what was going to happen next. Back aboard 1803, I fully opened the rear damper, cracked the front one, and partly closed the firebox door. A quick check to make sure the side feed lubricator was working, and then keep a sharp lookout until the train was clear of the station. Once the train was clear of the 15-mile-an-hour station restrictions, Des pulled the reverser up, opened the regulator into the second valve, and dropped the reverser over to around 50 to 55% to get the train away. Approaching the 40-mile-an-hour restriction through Vauxhall, we were probably doing around 35, no speedo fitted, so Des worked the engine hard. And the fire was now starting to burn white hot, and there was quite a firework display of sparks issuing forth from the chimney. Passing 9 Elms depot at about 40, the fire was burning through well, and we were holding our own for pressure. Approaching Queenstown Road, Des pulled up the reverser, put the regulator back to the first valve, and his side injector on, cutting it back nice and fine. The speed through Clapham was 40, and the accepted practice was to let the speed fall away rather than have to brake. By this point, one would be able to get some idea as how things were going. And if, for instance, the fire was getting slow to burn through, the dart, a chisel-ended fire iron, would be used to gently lift the back end of the heap to get some air into it. On 1803, though, all was well. An injector on, plenty of steam, and the fire door open to hold her back a bit. Passing the carriage washer, approaching Clapham, I put 6 to 8 good shovels under the door to keep the back of the box well filled. As the old girl lurched round the 40-mile-an-hour curve through the station, Des gave her the second regulator again and dropped the reverser out to around 40%. And 1803 seemed to set about things with a real effort. One could almost imagine that at this late stage in her working life, she was enjoying the chance to show us what she could really do. With the axle box horn wedges adjusted up, the ewes would ride well. But by today's standard, there was considerable vibration, and it was this that, at speed, tended to shake the fire towards the front of the box. All I had to do was keep the back filled up every 3 to 4 minutes. And as the engine started to work harder, literally I was filling the shovel up and holding it just inside the door, and the engine was pulling the coal off of the shovel. Through Clapham Cutting and onto the level stretch past Earl's Field, the speed gradually built up. Any enthusiast on Wimbledon platform that evening would have been treated to a rare display of a U-boat in full flight with a bit between her teeth. There was only one better place to be at that moment, and that was on the bucking rolling footplate of 1803 as we roared over the crossovers and through Wimbledon at around 50 miles an hour. I'd now settled into a good rhythm of firing and even had time to put my side injector on to keep the boiler water bobbing just above the top nut, and to use the slacking pipe to have a good wash round the cab and dampen the coal down. Once past New Malden, the official line speed rose to 85 miles an hour for steam-hauled trains, and apart from a couple of 75 mile an hour bands in the train, we could now really go for it. With clear signals through Surbiton, Des kept the engine hard at it, and I seem to recall that the fastest trains of the day were booked to pass Hampton Court Junction in 18 minutes after leaving Waterloo. It's very unlikely we achieved this, but I bet we weren't many minutes over that time. We reeled off the miles. Esher, Hersham, Walton and Wainbridge flew by, and all too soon Des shut off steam at West Byfleet, and we were routed onto the down local platform at Woking several minutes early. With time in hand, we put the pipe in to top up the tender, and I threw some coal forward whilst mails were loaded and vans detached from the rear of the train. 10 minutes or so later, we were on our way again and climbing the long drag up through Brookwood to Deepcut before our next stop at Farnborough. I was now confident enough with the engine to let the water come well down the glass in order to keep her quiet at the station, and with a load reduced to just over 300 tonnes, the going was much easier. After a fairly sedate run down the local to Basingstoke, more mails were loaded in and unloaded before dropping into the down yard to remarshal the train and await our book pathway to Eastleigh. More time up in the tender, throwing coal forward. Then after a couple of cups of tea, some 30 minutes later, we were away on the final stretch to Eastleigh. After turning the top of the bank at Lichfield Tunnel, 1803 fairly flew through the dark, and we must have exceeded 70 to 75 down through Waller's Ash before our final stop at Winchester. The final run to Eastleigh would see us put onto the down local at Shawford Junction before running into the Portsmouth Loop at Eastleigh at around 2000 hours, 3 hours after leaving Waterloo. The guard got off, the carriage shunter joined us in the cab, and we pulled the train into the down carriage sidings. My diary shows that we were booked relief at 22:10 by, I think, Fratton men at South Junction, probably on the Jubilee siding opposite the main works building. I think the engine worked through to Fratton, where after about 5 hours in traffic, she'd have probably been quite a rough square up. No drop grate on them in those days, lads. Much to my delight, on arrival at Waterloo on the next evening, there was 1803 again, and this time with 19 on, equal to 410 tonnes. If you want to know what happened next, I can only say, go back to line 1 and repeat. And some people say, how do you remember all this? And my reply is, if you'd done it, you'd never forget it either. And later on, in conversation with someone who's become a good friend of mine, an ex-Guildford fireman, Mac McClymont, he told me that during the late 50s, a U-class engine would leave Guildford early in the morning to go to Woking to work an early train, probably the first one, down to Southampton Terminus. En route, they would probably be relieved, possibly at Eastleigh, by Eastleigh men. And when Eastleigh men arrived at the terminus, they would go into the small loco servicing depot there. Probably the man in charge there, which at my time was a man called Reg Tilley, would probably throw a few shovels of coal up into the tender for them, and the engine would be turned, and it would then work from Southampton Terminus, probably via Southampton Central, to Andover. And on arrival at Andover, the Andover men would work through to Cheltenham. They would service the engine and then work back to Andover, get relief by Eastleigh men, who would then work back to Southampton Terminus, and the engine would again be turned and serviced and would work a late freight from Southampton docks up to Woking Yard, and then the engine would go back to Guildford. I think you can work out that was a fair number of miles from an engine in those days. And the logistics of the job, all the servicing and turning and the rostering of the crews, must have been extremely considerable. But that was a fair old turn for a U-class engine to undertake. So there you are, that's the U-class.
The following story that Bob relayed to me was an unusual Eastleigh turn of duty, because as the Bournemouth Electrification scheme was still in progress, the return working was diverted via the Mid-Hants line, sometimes called over the Alps. The locomotive they had throughout the turn that night was original Battle of Britain class number 34066 Spitfire, and some of my viewers may recall this locomotive being involved in the Lewisham disaster, where in dense fog, on the 4th of December 1957, she was in collision with a stationary passenger train where 90 people lost their lives and 173 people were injured. You will be pleased to hear that Bob's trip didn't end in disaster.
I've been connected with the Mid-Hants Railway for many years, and up until fairly recently, I was a regular active member there, driving there. In recent years, their War on the Line events, they've been treated to the sight of and sound of a Supermarine Spitfire fly past. And I've always thought I'd love to go along the Mid-Hants in a Spitfire, but I don't suppose it ever will happen. But in point of fact, I have been over the Mid-Hants in a Spitfire, and that Spitfire was 3466, the steam engine Spitfire. When I was a cleaner boy at Eastleigh, there was a lovely blue two-seat trainer kept there, and we often saw it flying around, and they used it in the air displays at Eastleigh Airport. But as I say, the only time I've been over the Mid-Hants in a Spitfire was 3466. And it was just 4 weeks or so before she was withdrawn in September 1966. And I worked to London and back with her. It was Saturday the 13th of August, and I was booked to work with driver Jack Morey on what was shown as 134 duty. And our locomotive 3466 was shown to be prepared for us. And at this time, the Bournemouth Electrification was in its final stages, and at weekends, trains would often be diverted, many of them over the Mid-Hants, to allow for the long permanent way possessions necessary to complete the electrification work. Our altered diagram would have us work a parcel and mails train to Waterloo, take the engine to 9 Elms depot and carry out requirements, which involved taking water, coal and cleaning the fire. And we would then go light the engine to Waterloo to work the 315 paper train back as far as Eastleigh via Alton. As always, there was always overtime on offer due to the shortages of men and machines, and I would often get there early in anticipation of earning a little bit extra by preparing my own engine. But the engine was prepared. I was asked by the foreman if I would do requirements on the pilot engine. Eastleigh always had 2 locomotives. One was the up-road pilot standby loco, and the other the down road. The engine that I was asked to look at was 73117 Vivian. They were kept in a 24-hour state of readiness in case of failures on the main line, and could generally be off-shed in about 15 to 20 minutes of call for them being received. Whilst the shed steam raisers would keep the fires alight in the boilers filled, they needed to be cold, watered and generally tidied up at least once every 24 hours. It was also not unknown for them to be raided for tools and lamps by late running firemen, definitely desperate to save time when preparing their own locos. Officially, one of the pit gang or shed engineman drivers should have accompanied me from the front of the shed to the disposal pit and coal stage, but it was a Saturday and there's not many managers about, so after pushing the fire over and raising a bit more steam, I took the loco over to the disposal pit. I dropped most of the accumulated ash in the grate, took water and then coal, and moved down to the pointsman's hut at the south end of the shed yard. And a quick word with Bert, the pointsman, and it was down over the bottom set of points whilst he set the road for number 8 through road in the shed, and then up over the top set of points and back into number 15 road. Push the fire under the brick arch, fill the boiler, and 15 minutes after climbing on, she was back in position, refreshed and all ready to go. Back in the lobby, Jack had arrived for our book turn, and on hearing what I'd just done, made some light-hearted comment like, "You'll never live to spend it, never." I left him with the tea can and went over the yard where our book loco 3466 Spitfire was waiting, supposedly ready prepared. I still had some 20 minutes to tidy up and have a wash round the cab before we do off shed. In those days, it was a bit of a lottery as to who got your loco ready and how well they did it. So if you wanted a reasonable start, it paid to get to the engine in good time. At the appointed time, we moved off the shed to the exit dummy, and I rang out on the rotary train describer to Eastleigh West Box. The exit dummy cleared, and we ran through the up platform to wait behind a dummy on the up local for our train to arrive in the platform and the engine to come off. My record of the journey to Waterloo shows that we left Eastleigh at 2010 with 18 vans equal to a load of 420 tonnes. As there are no comments regarding the trip, I assume that 3466 performed satisfactorily, and on arrival at Waterloo I uncoupled her from the train and we waited to assist the loco taking the stock to Clapham Yard out of the platform. It's interesting to note with regard to the uncoupling of the loco how this was done when compared to the way that we do it today on the Mid-Hants Railway and other preserved lines. On closely approaching the stopping point, 6 foot from the stopping blocks, the fireman would step off the still moving loco at a point where he knew the tender or front coach coupling would stop. As soon as the train stopped moving, it jumped down in between, uncoupled the vacuum and if necessary steam heat pipes, and place the engine vacuum pipe on its dummy. In the meantime, the driver would place a reverser in back gear, and on hearing the fireman yell, "Ease up," he would open the regulator and ease the loco onto the train. As the coupling slackened, the fireman would lift it off the hook, hang up the steam heat pipes, and replace the coach vacuum pipe onto its dummy. Job done in only 1.5 minutes. One can imagine a modern-day health and safety bureau jumping up and down on the spot at the very thought of this practice, but it was done hundreds of times a day throughout the country, and I never heard of anybody getting hurt. Some 15 to 20 minutes after arrival, with all the mail and luggage removed from the train and another loco coupled on the country end, the right-of-way trip was given for the empty train to depart for Clapham Yard, and Jack would push hard with 66 to give the train engine, probably an 82,000 tank at that time, a good start out of the station before stopping at the platform signal. Shortly the signal cleared and displayed main through for us to leave Waterloo and run tender first through Vauxhall to 9 Elms Loco Junction box. And here we'd ran forward down the incline into the shed disposal pit. During the waiting time at Waterloo and the short run to 9 Elms, I'd prepared the fire for cleaning. I tried to leave Waterloo with a near full boiler pressure and a full glass of water, and this would get us to 9 Elms, and should see us arrive on the pit with 2/3 of a glass and 160 to 180 pounds of steam. The clean, non-clinkered fire would be put up one side, that is moved to one side of the firebox. We'll assume the right-hand side, and with a long-handled clinker shovel, with a few shovels of coal added to the heat to burn through if necessary. During the run to the shed, the fire door would be kept shut to conserve heat. And we arrived on shed at 00:25 hours. Once on the pit, the ash pan hopper would be opened and the centre drop section of the grate would be lowered. If this was jammed and would not open, as was often the case, the whole job would have to be done with a clinker shovel via the firebox and cab door. The clinker and ash from the left-hand side of the grate and under the door would be cleared and deposited through the drop section hole into the pit. Once this was done, the clean fire would be moved from the right to the left-hand side of the firebox and a few more shovels of coal added to burn through. The right-hand grate area would now be cleared before closing the centre drop section. And finally, the heap of clean fire would be spread across the rear of the grate and more coal placed on top to burn through in preparation for making up the fire before departure. Whilst on the pit, Jack would check round the engine, topping up various oiling points, and we would take coal and water. After a visit to the turntable, there was just time for a cup of tea and a sandwich in the depot mess room. And around 2 o'clock, Jack and I rejoined the engine for a 2:15 departure to Waterloo. After receiving permission, we moved the loco up the short, steep incline from the exit road to the head shunt alongside the down local line to wait for the signalman in Loco Junction box to give us a road back to Waterloo. And while we waited for the 2:15 fast papers to pass on the down main, I filled up the back corners of the firebox and dropped a few shovels under the door. The steam coals that we had in those days took a good while longer to get going than the coal that we get today, although we would stand on the train for around 40 minutes at Waterloo. And the weight of all those bundles of newspaper meant that the gross weight of the train would considerably exceed the tear. I had plenty of room in the boiler for water, so I was taking no chances. The signalman gave us a road, and 10 minutes later we were coupled onto our train and enjoying yet another cup of tea. Our guard arrived and told Jack we have 12 coaches on for 400 tonnes. Guards became very adept at working out their loads, and I imagine that nearly every 12 coach 315 papers to leave Waterloo was assessed as a standard 12 for 400 mate. Our train consisted of 3 passenger coaches and 9 bogie vans. At that time of the year, steam heating was as required, so some steam was put through the train at the guard's request just to take the chill off. The train had been in the station since around 1:30 hours and loading was well underway, with large barrows of newspaper being transferred from lorries to the train. The sorters would travel in some of the vans on the journey to prepare deliveries for quick dispatch at the later calling point on its journey. During the next 30 minutes or so, I gradually made up a large fire until starting time, around 3/4 of a tonne of coal and fire would be ready to provide the steam to shift an all-up weight of around 600 tonnes of loco, train and newspapers. Across the river, the hands on the clock face of Big Ben moved relentlessly towards departure time. There was for me always an air of excitement surrounding the departure from Waterloo in the steam era. 3:10 and the final preparations for departure were taking place. Doors were slammed shut, the guard was looking at his watch, and the platform starting signal showed a green, all clear on the end of the platform. My fire was now burning through well, and an injector was on to keep the safety valves from lifting in those last few moments before we started away. And there, spot on 3:15, the guard's green light. Right away, mate. With a short bout of slipping so characteristic of billiard Pacifics, Jack and Spitfire moved the heavy train away from the platform. I turned the injector off, half closed the fire door, and sat on my seat, leaning out the cab window into the cool night air to check the signals on the long right-hand curve leaving Waterloo. With greens all the way through Vauxhall and down past 9 Elms, the speed gradually rose until passing Queenstown Road, Jack shut off steam for the 40-mile restriction through Clapham Junction. As we lurched round the curve through the platform, Jack opened the regulator wide and shortened the cut-off, and I began to regularly feed 4 or 5 shovelfuls of coal on and over the large heap of fire under the door, and Spitfire started to do just that. None of the bullion Pacifics were fitted with spark arresters, and when worked hard, they would throw lumps of burning coal small enough to go through the tubes high into the air, and it was quite a sight to see. I seem to recall being told that when an attempt was made to fit them with spark arresters, it was quickly abandoned after the 9 Elms crews threatened to refuse to take them into service. Such was the effect on their performance. We arrived at Woking well up to time, and as we stood waiting for station duties to be completed, a member of platform staff told Jack that there would be a considerable delay as the diesel that was booked to assist us via Alton had failed, and they were waiting for a driver trained on the Cromptons, later the Type 33s, to sign on at Guildford to bring a replacement to Woking. Now, Jack didn't like doing overtime, and because I signed on early, I was have been on duty for 12 hours by the time we got back on the shed. So Jack left the footplate and went to sort things out, in inverted commas. He later told me that he phoned control and told them straight, we ain't hanging about here all night waiting for no bloody diesel, we'll go without it. The financial penalties for delay to mail and paper trains were quite considerable, so control readily agreed that the driver of the failed diesel would to conduct Jack as far as Alton from where Jack knew the road, and he agreed to ride with us to Winchester to avoid us having to stop at Alton. And so we departed Woking near right time with another firework display up through Brookwood before slowing to take the Aldershot and Alton Road at Cartwright Junction. Now, 46 years later, 36 of which I regularly drove trains over this route, I know it like the back of my hand. My trip with 3466 was my first one at night between Cartwright and Alton. The Guildford driver was now in the driving seat and punched the engine away from the junction, up the climb to Foxhill's Tunnel with great gusto, another firework display. With my limited number of the route, there was some blowing off as the loco was eased through Aldershot, and again while negotiating the sharp curve at Farnham. Away we went again with a clear road through Farnham and some fairly speedy running through Bentley. The Guildford man spoke to Jack, and I was told to get some in there for the climb out of Alton. And Jack took over the driving approach in Alton, whereupon the Guildford driver said to me, "You can have the token then, mate." And so it was left to me to stand behind Jack and catch the single line token at around 35 miles an hour. It didn't hurt as much as I thought it was going to, but had I missed it and we'd had to stop to fetch it, subsequent events could have turned out quite differently. The reason for the high-speed pickup was, of course, that we were now faced with the climb from Alton to Medstead. It must have been quite a show as we stormed up the hill. No problems for steam with a Bulliard boiler. The harder you hit them, the harder they steam, provided the stoker could keep up. Over the next 5 minutes or so, most of my fire was gone. I had about a ton of fire in there at the start of the climb, but much of it was spread over half of Hampshire once we got to the top of the bank at Medstead. As it was all downhill, pretty much all the way to Winchester, our next stop, there were no problems in keeping the engine and steam up. The injector was on most of the way to Alresford, and we sailed through the darkened halt at Brockley. Nothing much will ever happen there, will it? At 75 mile an hour plus, before slowing to exchange tokens at Alresford. Another little dash. The Mid-Hants regularly saw high-speed running in BR days. Through Itchin Abbas, before giving up the tyres single line tablet at Winchester Junction and dropping down into Winchester City Station. We were well up to time, and the opportunity was taken to have a wash in the bucket in anticipation of a quick getaway home after getting relief at Eastleigh shed. It was now gone 5 o'clock, and Jack and I were both tired. It had been a long night. The guard gave us a tip, and we set off on the last short hop to Eastleigh. As we passed Shawford at around 65 mile an hour, Jack shut off steam, and I attempted to put an injector on, only it didn't pick up. Try again, still no go. So I attempted to start the other one with the same result. And a quick look at the tender gauge and the tap on the bottom of the tender confirmed we'd run out of water. Waterloo to Eastleigh with an assisting diesel from Woking would not have required us to take water en route, but with the additional trials and tribulations of the journey, we both failed to take into account the extra water usage. 3466 had one of the smaller capacity tenders, and what with the additional blowing off, 10 gallons a minute goes out of the safety valve at full bore, and the extra work performed, she'd used considerably more water. Had I missed the token at Alton, the additional stop and ensuing struggle up the bank to Medstead would have seen us run out of water even earlier. We now had just over half a glass of water, and the safety valves had lifted, plus there was no water column on the platforms at Eastleigh. As we stopped at the platform, the shunter walking towards us to uncouple was probably quite surprised to see me darting between to unhook. The dummy was off, and we quickly scuttled off the shed. A quick word with John at the blowdown pit. "No chance of a blowdown today, mate." And we dropped down onto a fortunately unoccupied disposal pit and quickly put the pipe in to fill the tank with water. I expect the crew on the ash pans were also somewhat puzzled by our enthusiasm in taking water for them as well. So that was it. We'd made 4 hours overtime, or I'd made 4 hours overtime again, and learnt another valuable lesson, and we had saved the day just. Plus, I could now truthfully say I've been over the Alps in a Spitfire.
With reference to Bob's earlier driving experiences on the Mid-Hants, I had the good fortune to be invited to join him and operations manager Richard Bentley for a day's outing on V-Class Schools number 925 Cheltenham on the 9th of July 2015. Exactly 48 years to the day that I left Guildford for Salisbury on the final day of steam on the southern region. I hadn't fired or driven a schools class since my earlier firing career at Guildford in 1961, and must say the experiences that day brought back many happy memories. Here are some photos and a short video of that day. Oh, that's the way. That'll make us big. Doing on the paintbrush. The day for me was truly memorable, and I would like to thank Bob and Richard again for the privilege of working with two very experienced enginemen.